This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. My guest, Greg Jaffe, is the Pentagon correspondent for the Washington Post, and before that covered the military for the Wall Street Journal. We're going to talk about Afghanistan, some mistakes the military has made there, and the direction it appears to be headed in now. The New York Times reports today that President Obama's advisors are coalescing around a strategy that would focus on protecting about 10 top population centers, not the countryside and the remote regions. Jaffe wrote a series of articles about a battle in a remote region called Wanat that exemplifies the problems the military encounters in the countryside of Afghanistan. Jaffe is also the co-author of a new book that helps explain how Iraq changed the Army, why it's now emphasizing counterinsurgency, and the disagreements that continue in the military about the effectiveness of that strategy in the Middle East. The book is called The Fourth Star: Four Generals and the Epic Struggle for the Future of the United States Army. The generals are George Casey and John Abizaid, who led the troops in Iraq until 2007, and Peter Chiarelli and David Petraeus, who then changed the strategy in Iraq to counterinsurgency. Petraeus is now the commander of CENTCOM. Greg Jaffe, welcome to Fresh Air. The four generals who you write about started their professional military careers in the 70s. Did they each take different lessons away from Vietnam?
Yeah, Vietnam is a powerful thing kind of lurking in the background of the book and lurking in almost every officer's life from that era. I mean, all these guys miss Vietnam, but they all join an army in the early 70s that's badly broken by it, really at its nadir. But the big army, I think, learns a lesson that with regard to Vietnam that, oh my gosh, we're never going to do that again. We're not going to fight another guerrilla war. Wars need to be fast and quick, and we need to use overwhelming firepower to destroy the enemy. And we can vote not to fight an insurgency like they had in Vietnam. I think Abizaid and Petraeus in particular both realized that armies don't always get to choose the wars they're in, and that they needed to be ready at some level to fight this kind of war. But both Abizaid and Petraeus, for most of their careers within that context, are dissidents within the larger army.
I was really interested in your descriptions of General Abizaid, who helped lead the war in Iraq in its first stage, but didn't seem to agree with the philosophy that the army was using. Abizaid's great-grandfather was Lebanese. Abizaid speaks fluent Arabic. He spent time in the Middle East before the war in Iraq, and it sounds like he was very skeptical of the Iraq war from the start, yet he helped lead it. He was the commander of all military forces in the region, the position that Petraeus later took over. So would you explain why he was skeptical of the invasion from the start?
Yeah, I mean, he does spend a lot of time in the Middle East. Now, he doesn't grow up speaking Arabic. He actually teaches himself Arabic, or goes to the Defense Language Institute, and then spends 2 years in Jordan at the University of Oman as a student. Then he spends 1 year in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, in the mid-'80s, watching the Israelis fight a very tough insurgency with Shiite extremists, and particularly Hezbollah, which is just beginning to emerge at that period. I think he has a sort of deep appreciation for the culture, religion, and the huge role those play in the Middle East in terms of determining the fate of kind of countries and how wars unfold. So I think he was deeply skeptical. I mean, he likes to say you can't control the Middle East. If you try, it'll end up controlling you. So I think he was deeply skeptical of these sort of grand ambitions to change places, particularly Iraq, where he also has an experience at the end of the Gulf War, an experience that's very different from the rest of the United States Army, and leads him to take very different lessons from the Gulf War than most of the U.S. Army.
So how did Abizaid's Gulf War experience shape his thinking on Iraq?
Well, most of the armies for the Gulf War is the 100-hour tank battle, which is this tank-on-tank fight in which the U.S. Army, obliterates the Iraqi army. Abizaid has a different experience. He misses the tank battle. He's stuck in Italy, much to his chagrin and disappointment for that, but is sent in the latter days of the war, essentially after the war, to northern Iraq on a mission to protect the Kurds. It quickly turns to he's also protecting the Iraqi army and the Iraqi army soldiers from the Kurds. And Iraqi soldiers are running to his checkpoint. And he tells this very interesting story. In the latter days of his mission there, he's walking with a Kurdish Peshmerga, a Kurdish militia fighter. And the Kurds have caught a couple of Iraqi soldiers who are stragglers. And they grab these Iraqis and they torture them and then kill them. And Abizaid, in his very typical John Abizaid way, says, hey, if you're going to kill them anyway, why do you bother to torture them? And the Peshmerga, the militia, Kurdish militia fighter, says, well, nobody fears death. People fear torture. And we have to kill them and torture them and leave them in the middle of the road as an example to the other Iraqi soldiers not to mess with us anymore. And at that point, I think Abizaid, who already sensed this, realizes that the Iraq War might be over for the U.S. Army. It might be over for the United States of America, but it's still continuing for the Iraqi people and continues throughout the 90s until we invade the country again in 2003.
If you're just joining us, my guest is Greg Jaffe. He's the Pentagon correspondent for the Washington Post and the author of the new book, The Fourth Star, Four Generals and the Epic Struggle for the Future of the U.S. Army. We've talked a little bit about General Abizaid and why he was really skeptical that the war in Iraq would work because he knew so much about the Middle East and the ethnic and religious divisions there. Let's jump ahead and look at General Petraeus, who becomes the leader of the forces in Iraq, and he believes that counterinsurgency can work. Again, he becomes a career Army person in the 70s after Vietnam. What did he take away from Vietnam that made him think counterinsurgency is going to work in Iraq?
You know, it's interesting. It's less what he took away and where he came from. I mean, the Army, we think of it as this sort of big green monolith, but it's actually a collection of sort of tribes and sub-tribes. And Petraeus is from this really interesting sub-tribe called the Soc Department. It's essentially professors, officers who are chosen as professors, sent to the best graduate schools, and then teach for a couple years at West Point before they go back out into the service. They teach cadets economics, political science, international relations. And Petraeus grows up in the Soc Department. And when he's there, it's an interesting time in the mid-'80s. The Soc Department is taking very different lessons about the Vietnam War than the rest of the Army. The rest of the Army kind of looks at Vietnam, as I said, and says, oh gosh, we never want to do that again, and we can vote not to do it. The Soc Department argues that the mistake the Army made was not fighting a guerrilla war, but fighting a guerrilla war badly, and that wars were more than just about destroying the enemy and firepower, and that if you really wanted to fight a counterinsurgency, you had to focus on protecting the population, on economics, on politics. Military officers had to be masters of sort of all of these domains. And this is the environment in which Petraeus sort of spends a lot of his time as an impressionable major. And I think that's where he kind of thinks to himself, hey, we can do this. Counterinsurgency is something we can sort of master.
So when Petraeus becomes the commander of the forces in Iraq, he changes the nature of the war in Iraq, turns it into a counterinsurgency, tries to persuade or buy off insurgents and get them to side with the Iraqi government and with the U.S. How much do you think he's changed thinking within the military about how the military should be fighting wars today?
I think he's had a huge impact just in terms of what officers do and how they approach war. I mean, Petraeus is a incredibly adaptable kind of guy. I mean, on the one hand, he looks kind of rigid. He's very sort of detail-focused, you know, as an officer, as a kind of battalion and brigade commander, a lieutenant colonel and colonel. I mean, he was notorious kind of micromanager with regard to having bazillions of rules upon rules upon rules. But as a general, he's surprisingly adaptable and redefines sort of what it means to be an officer. There's one example that I think sort of shows it. When this is in Mosul, when he's there in 2003. Mosul is ultimately a failure for a lot of reasons, but it's an illuminating failure. I mean, Petraeus is there, and and one of the big problems is the locals badly want electricity. So he cuts a deal with the Syrians in which he sells them Iraqi oil for electricity without cluing in the State Department. I think he realizes that if he asked the State Department, they might tell him no. So it was better just to do it and then have them undo it. But it's interesting. He has these week-long negotiations with the Syrians. They finally agree, fly out to the border to open the valve to send Iraqi oil into Syria in exchange for electricity. They slaughter a lamb and dip their hands in the blood and then touch their hands on the pipeline. And Petraeus does this as well. And I asked him, how did it feel? He said, warm. But it goes to sort of what you have to do to be effective in these environments. And it's almost, he plays the role of a tribal sheikh out there. I mean, he's the sheikh of the biggest, most powerful tribe in northern Iraq in 2003, which is the 101st Airborne Division. And he recognizes that, you have to throw yourself into this culture in that way to be effective.